Welcome to Cypher After Hours with myself, Brett, and my two wonderful co-hosts, Emily and David. Thank you for also supporting us and our endeavor on this journey to create, hopefully, an exciting and entertaining podcast about psychical functioning, mysteries, esoteric, and the occasional guest, which we hope to have in the future. So what we're doing here in After Hours is we're going to continue the discussion that we had in the pre-show, which is going off the deep end. And I think what we're going to talk about, it's going to be a little bit more loose, a little bit more freeform in these after-hour shows, where we can just kind of go back and forth, talk a little bit more personal stories, and then even practical applications. I think especially on this topic is a really important one. How do we manage it? I know when I was starting, this is something that I was in dire need of and was looking for constantly, is how do I manage this stuff that I'm experiencing? And unfortunately for me, there wasn't a lot, at least that I stumbled across, that really worked for me. But hopefully it gives a little bit of insight and maybe a direction for how, if you're interested in doing this, if you're interested in trying to incorporate a little bit more discernment into your day-to-day life, take it perhaps from a couple people who have gone down this road already.
You mentioned there, Brett, that you were in dire need of this stuff and there wasn't much out there. And I think it actually is out there, but you need to have developed your discernment in order to find the stuff that allows you to develop your discernment. It is a chicken and egg thing, because it was a word which, I heard people mentioning when I was first getting into this stuff. And they were saying, "Oh, you must develop your discernment." And I go, "Well, how?" And I can't remember really what I did. I'm not sure I can really take credit for that process happening. I think it goes hand in hand with a lot of other stuff that I did, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit later. But should we start with our feet on the ground?
Well, yeah, I think to your point there, I didn't know what I should be looking for was kind of the problem. Is I knew that these topics fascinated me. I knew that I had my own experiences that were very, very real that I couldn't discount, but I didn't know really what to do about it and how to integrate it into my everyday life. And that was, I imagine that's a challenge for a lot of people, that if they're getting into remote viewing, what do you do with this information? How do you, you already feel potentially slightly, well, you're not part of the default crew. So you're not going to go around talking about these things with the random person necessarily on the street. Now, maybe it's a little bit more loose nowadays and people are a little bit more receptive than back in 2010. But I remember when I saw that UFO that turned my reality upside down and it took off like a bat out of hell, like warp drive engage, and didn't make a sound in the sky. And I told a couple people about it because I was like, I need to say this to someone. I need to communicate this to someone. And I just got the most odd, strange looks from people that I knew for a really long time. Like I had gone mental. Then it made me really leery of, oh, maybe I can't talk about this with other people. And then that was a whole thing I had to deal with too, because I had to keep it to myself. And it's like I had this secret that I couldn't share. And I had my own withholding of my experience and my reality from those I was living with in day-to-day life. And that was challenging too. And so if we can share some of our tips along the way, that if it helps a little bit for some people, I wish I would have known these things. I'm sure it was out there. I just didn't know where to look. That's all.
So I think it's also important to just briefly touch on the informational landscape that is out there, that is available to us, because it's definitely not unbiased and it's definitely not passive. There are programs out there that are designed to intentionally mislead people. So I won't just say one narrative, but there's a series of default narratives out there that are suitable for most people. And there are energies or forces or groups that want to keep these people in these narratives. If you think you're clever and you think you're going to jump out of this, well, they have a plan B or a plan C or a plan D for you to fall into. So there are many, many, many informational booby traps or pitfalls you can fall into. And then the question becomes, how do you not fall into them? And that's just something I wanted to bring to light, is that it's not just this passive informational landscape you're going to go out there. It's very much uh, full of architected and designed things that are designed to mislead you, and they may even bury truth into a narrative that is then completely crazy. And so you'll have this grounding point. You'll feel you're grounded because, yes, I know this one thing is true, and this person says that one thing, and then they say 10 other things. Therefore, those 10 other things are true. Well, no, the 10 other things are intentionally lies. Whether this person is been fed them by people trying to mislead them, or they themselves are just being deceitful on purpose. There's many of these people out there, so it's just very important to be mindful of this as you go into these journeys.
I just want to quickly loop back to what you were saying, Brett, about feeling the need to talk to somebody about it. I think that's really common, that you have this experience and it's like, wow, wow, people don't know about this. I should tell people about this. It's so cool. It's so interesting. It's so significant. And then, just like you, discovering that people really don't want to hear about it. Well, I don't want to use the phrase they can't handle the truth, but we've talked about our own experiences that, there's all sorts of different experiences that push people into this, but it takes a push often, doesn't it? Like I would never have looked at this stuff without having no choice.
Well, this is really one of the dangers, though, and why discernment is so important. And I think we should talk about specifics here in a minute. But this need of needing to reach out, you have an experience or you see something, or maybe it's not even your experience, but it just resonates so strongly with you that it just, there's something true about this. And you want to communicate, you want to interact with someone else to help you understand it, because you don't have the capability or the know-how or even just the information. And so, or you just want to share it with someone so you feel a little bit more sane. I think that's a normal human tendency. But one of those traps that exists out there is there are people, unfortunately, that prey on individuals who are in that state, and those exist. It's very problematic.
It's only love and light, but it's actually love, light, and $5,000.
It's also I'll take your $5,000 from you too. Yeah, but that's not the reality, and I know that's not the reality. Now I feel like I was fortunate enough not to get wrapped up in those, but I've had a lot of people, whether they were my own personal past students or people that just reached out to me because I've been a somewhat public figure in the remote viewing field over the past 6-7 years, where they've told me about their experiences in some of these more cult-like groups that either called themselves remote viewers or something else that's not remote viewing, but it's related. And they're just straight up cults.
I think that highlights a good rule of thumb, actually, which is nobody is coming to save you. So anything that suggests that there is, or there are, or all you need to do is all red flags.
That's right. Be your own hero. Save yourself. It's definitely not an easy path, and there's actually, I think it's important to also mention, there's no shame in um sort of turning back if you're not ready to take on these responsibilities, and you feel you need to do some more work on yourself before you do venture into esoteric topics. Then by all means take that time and work on yourself, in terms of getting your psychology to a stable place. Work on some meditation practices, which I'm sure Brett has some good suggestions there on how to do that. Work on some critical thinking skills if that's an area that you think you're lacking in. You don't even know what a logical fallacy is, for example. Not that these are the be all and end all in determining what is true for you, but they're just tools in the toolbox. And I think if you're venturing out and your backpack is empty, you may want to turn back around, load up the backpack with all these wonderful tools, and make sure you're prepared before you go out into the esoteric wilderness.
there's an alternative kind of perspective which totally agrees with that, but might be surprising to some people, which is a magical training system, a self-initiation course, which involves meditation and ritual and introspection and that sort of thing. And you get to a certain point in this course, and then it says, now you need to make sure that you're really sane. Go and see a therapist. And not like a priest or a shaman or something, a therapist. You need to get your head in order before you go on to the next chapter because, it is dangerous if you don't, and you could go crazy. And like I've personally witnessed people going full hospitalized psychotic episode crazy from this stuff. It is like I don't want to say that will definitely happen. That's not a big risk, but it does happen. Um, it's this is a real thing and a real risk, and it shouldn't be taken lightly. Go to therapy.
Yeah, without without kind of breaking or bringing anyone's real names in this, I definitely don't want to do that, but I have seen that. I have seen firsthand in person someone have a mental breakdown and start having really horrible thoughts directed at those around them because they went too deep into the remote viewing, that they started hearing voices in their head and they started having thoughts and images that were not good, and going really deep into the remote viewing. This was not because of remote viewing, mind you, in my personal opinion and the opinion of some others. This was unhandled trauma that they had that was getting stirred up and triggered because of remote viewing, the practice of remote viewing itself. So it's not that remote viewing or I think psychical functioning, these are natural human abilities. It's when someone's not prepared, hasn't done their work, and then comes to this field and expects everything to be hunky-dory and love and light and there's no pitfalls, is going to have a seriously rude awakening. I know I had a rude awakening. Now I didn't go mental. I didn't have that kind of baggage. I had different kind of baggage where I had stuff from my past that I didn't realize was influencing some of my, let's just say, interest in the esoteric that I hadn't really handled. So some experiences from different points in my life that I just ignored as not being real. And then I also had even when I started remote viewing more, I did, because when you start developing these techniques, you begin opening the aperture. If an aperture like on a camera, the more you do it, the wider the more light you can take in, the more information you start taking in by just practicing these techniques. So I began perceiving more information about what was going on around me, and a lot of it to really high fidelity levels that it really freaked me out. I started actually seeing some really strange things in my environment. It changed my dream life completely when I started doing it. And then even just my spontaneous intuitions that were happening got really spooky and I didn't know how to handle it. So what I did, because this is, I think, one of the maybe the value adds that why this is what we have to offer in this after hours, is what did we each do about it? And I know one of the things, there's two specific things that I can point to that really moved the bar for me on handling, and then also increasing my personal discernment. Number one was meditation, and not any kind of hunky dory listening to a meditation app on your iPhone because it's going to improve your work ethic. It's not that. It's actually the one I used and the one I have recommended to many of my other students and friends who have used it, family members, and each of them has always come back to me if they stuck to it and went, wow, this changed things for me. Thank you. It's very, very simple. It's a 3-step meditation. And you can make it as long or as short as you want. You can do each step for 5 minutes or each step for 10 minutes. So it's like 30 minutes, work up to it at your own pace. But it's really simple. The very first thing you do, step one, is you do a 5 or 10 minute segment of mantra meditation. Now, what does that mean? A mantra could be anything. I like to use English, and I like to use a positive statement, really simple, like, I am deserving of love. That's a good one that I've used a lot. Or I am worthy of love, something like that, something that you want in your life. And what a mantra is a repetition of that statement. What actually that repetition does is it pushes out all the other noise in your environment. And then you just sit in a comfortable chair and make sure you won't be disturbed and just repeat the phrase over and over and over and over again. And after about a couple minutes, 5 minutes of this, it's almost like you don't even really register the words anymore. It's just a trance that you help put your certainly your brain waves are changing as you're doing this. You're probably going from a high functioning state to a more trance-like state. When you do this, it just brings you there by dint of the activity. But you do that for about 5 or 10 minutes. Step 2 is a little bit more challenging, but it's the thing that most meditations avoid, which is somewhat one of the problems with them, in my opinion. But the next 5 or 10 minutes, what you do is you bring in a difficult emotion from somewhere in your life. Maybe you had an argument with someone in the past, or someone yelled at you, or you felt sad about something, and you bring it in and you just sit with it. You just sit with it. You're not trying to change it. You're not trying to fully analyze it. Your goal with this is just to sit and be okay sitting with it. And this goes this it builds off the idea of the more exposed you are to something, the less of an impact it's going to have with the repeated exposure to it. So you want to get over your fear of heights? Well, go experience that for a very short, limited amount of time, and then stop. I say, want to get over your fear of spiders? One of the techniques you can do is, well, put a spider, put it in a box, and be in the same room with it for 10 seconds, and then leave. And then come back the next day and do 12 seconds, and then leave. And then eventually what you do is, because of the repetition, you can actually work your way up to being able to be in that room for as long as you want with that spider, and it's not going to cause you a panic attack. This is the same thing you can do with your emotions. And it doesn't necessarily immediately solve anything, but it builds that. It's like you're lifting a weight that you've never learned to develop in your life on how to handle emotions without reacting in a really horrible way. And so you do that for 5 or 10 minutes. You just bring it in and you sit with it, and your goal is just to sit. That's it, and not lose attention of what the emotion is. Final part of the meditation is it's an open eye meditation, actually. And so what you do is you go around whatever's in your space, whether it's in your office or in your bedroom or wherever you are. And your goal with this last 5 to 10 minute segment is to put your attention on different inanimate objects and identify what it would be like as if you were that object. So I see my coffee cup on my table. Maybe I'll open my eyes and I'll look at my coffee cup and I'll imagine I am that coffee cup. What is it like to be a coffee cup? Interesting. I have a green paint around me with a curve, and I'm so heavy. I'm made out of porcelain. And you go through this process of, what would your senses tell you if you were that coffee cup? Well, I maybe can feel the warm heat because there's coffee within the inner curve of me. And once you kind of exhaust one object, you go to another object. Then you go to another object, and you do that process for 5 to 10 minutes. In summary, number 1, mantra. Number 2, sitting with a difficult emotion. And number 3, open eyes meditation, learning to yield and then return with your attention and your perception. Doing that meditation in repetition over a couple months will have dramatic impacts on what you can handle and what you can perceive. It's very simple, but it has to be a practice.
I think a good thing to note here is, with meditation, every day is better. Don't save it all up for a Saturday and try and do a 6-hour sit on Saturday and then spend the rest of the week slacking off. Better to do 5 minutes every day than do it irregularly. Just make it a natural habit that you get into. So we've talked about the willingness to change our minds, which links back to what we were talking about earlier with ego and its foundation upon worldview and identifying with and identifying as. I think one great thing about meditation is that it helps you to see past that. I mean, the Buddhists got a lot of stuff right, and I think this is one of them. But it helps you to see past that identifying with stuff and as stuff. So it kind of unhooks you from dependence upon being a job title or a political party or a sports team or a nationality or whatever it is. which is easier said than done, but it's super valuable because, if our ideas and our models are not propping up our ego, then we don't need to be right. We don't need to defend our beliefs. We're actually really happy if something comes along that successfully challenges them, because that improves our model. Because our goal then is approaching truth. It's not defending our castle.
Yeah, that's a really good point, David. I have very often I usually take the approach with people that I want to present my idea in hopes that they're going to find a problem with it, right? I'm looking to test my theory as like I found this information. I think this is true. Please tell me why it's not, and do so in a reasonable way. Now you have to find people who aren't gonna react badly in terms of have emotional upheaval because you're even asking the question upsets their worldview. But I think that can be a healthy approach to, okay, you found something new. You do have a trusted individual who you can have these conversations with. Ask them to try to poke holes in your discovery. Devil's advocate, critical thinking. Um, Try and find other sources. It can be very uncomfortable to consume content that goes contrary to a narrative that you might believe or prefer. But then, as you're going through that contrary narrative, try and poke holes in that too. Try and see what the other side says and try and disprove. Not, I think prove is the wrong word. Think critically about what each side is saying as you're going through this process, as opposed to latching on to the first thing you see and carrying that forward. I think there was I'm not sure, maybe one of you knows, but the psychological term for fixating on a particular idea, it's almost like it's easier to fool a person than it is to get a person to realize they've been fooled. Does that make sense?
Is that like it's easier to put something new in than it is to take something away? Um, which you see when you try to deal with your own trauma, actually, isn't it? You can't just delete files out of your mind. You gotta replace them with something. You gotta overwrite them, because you can put stuff in, but you can't just go, oh, I don't need that anymore. I mean, I am generalizing hugely, of course, but it's overwriting stuff is much easier than deleting it.
Yeah. Do you guys have any other practical tips that you guys have used in the past that have helped increase your own personal discernment?
Being immensely suspicious of everybody. Ask who benefits.
Follow the money.
Well, do follow the money, but look at not just the money, look at the incentive, and look at that from a psychological perspective, because you have, like, people will tell lies, for one of a kind of word, for multiple reasons. So, they may believe the lie, and they've fallen down a rabbit hole, and now they want to share their rabbit hole with you. But that rabbit hole they're now a flat earther, and now you have to join their team then, and then it's just like supporting a sports team or something. It becomes a thing, and the need that's being fulfilled there is kind of obvious. So even though maybe nobody's getting paid, nobody's overtly exploiting anybody, everybody's in a conspiracy to support each other's worldviews and validate each other by this kind of circular, we're all on the same team thing.
David, interesting. You touched. I don't want to pick on them too much, but the flat Earth is an interesting uh, topic because I personally took, I think, probably 3 or 4 weeks of my life, and I was, and I do this with most things when I find resistance. Oh, these people they're into some crazy conspiracy, and rather than writing it off just on its face, I will take the time to understand their perspectives. Many of these things, including the flat earthers, they have very clever explanations and very poignant questions about how do we know what we know about the earth in terms of its shape and all that. Now, if you dig deep enough, you will find that a lot of their narrative falls apart, but you have to be very clever, you have to be very dedicated, and not everyone digs that deep before they fall into the trap of the, oh, this is my group, they brought up 3 good points that I agree with, therefore everything else must be true and they're friendly, so now I'm identifying as one of them, and it's hard for me to see the opposite. So
That goes back to what we were saying right at the beginning this evening about if you've got a worldview, you can't see the bottom and the top at the same time. And like you say, you have to dig deep before you find the problems and before it all collapses. But if you look at the surface, you can see, oh, well, that's a very specific, clever argument about this niche little thing, and it joins onto another very specific, clever argument about that little niche thing. But it's kind of like a surface level bunch of arguments, and it's not grounded, it doesn't go all the way down. But each individual bit looks great, so it's convincing to a cursory inspection.
yeah, there's definitely a need to be able to dive deep on topics, but then simultaneously not get lost in them. Now, I have a pretty good memory, so I am able to retain more of my worldview in my mind at once. But I think, as a recommendation to people who maybe can't, so it's almost like you want to have a way of documenting the things you thought were true prior to going into researching one of these topics, and always keep that as a reference point on the side. Keep it handy as, okay, what did I believe before I started researching this? What do I believe now? It's fine to challenge your beliefs, but almost have a map of where you started. So it's sort of like going into the forest. You have a map in hand. You have a starting point on there. It's always important to know where you are relative to your starting point. It's almost like having I think when they go caving, they have this thing called literally called a guideline, which is a physical rope that they take into the cave with them that you can use to pull your way back out if you've realized you've made a wrong turn. So if you have a great memory, be mindful of these things. If you don't, write them down. Those would be some of the practical things you could do before venturing out on a new topic.
Yeah, I think there's another way that I would look at it as well. Not only having a rope that to pull yourself back out and to see, well, how does this contrast? It's contrasting is what it sounds like you're doing when you're making sure that you framed sufficiently where you are so that you don't get led down a garden path, so to speak, without realizing it. And now you've done it for reasons that you didn't even realize you were doing it, which was maybe being the idea of being included in a group, or the idea of what's another sexy one? I'm smarter than everybody else.
Well, to feel empowered by knowing the answers.
Yep. And then there's almost like it's one of those traps that a lot of people fall into is, I have all the answers of things that are going on with this thing and no one else does. That makes me better than them. And that is a very self-destructive way of operating, because you've just trapped yourself is what you've done. You've just trapped yourself in a very immobile structure and model that for whatever that thing is. The only way that you stop that from occurring is by being vigilant. You have to be vigilant. You have to know where you are. You have to be able to frame what you currently believe to be able to evaluate whether this is happening right now. And you only get that through vigilance. If you slack off on that and you don't do the work, so to speak, then this is very likely to happen to you. And I mean, another thing that I've done that I found immensely useful for discernment, but it's also being aware and asking the question, is there something that I'm actually afraid of? And if there is, that might actually move you into conclusions or into areas that are not grounded in truth, or at least your best discernment of what truth is. One piece of advice, it's you have to be constantly vigilant and you can't stop ever. I don't think or else it's gonna, you're gonna fall off the path. It's never ending vigilance and part of the never ending journey.
I think a point of vigilance is that you've got to have the awareness before you can apply it vigilantly. You can't be vigilant with your eyes closed. So if you don't do your meditation and your therapy or whatever equivalents you might like to deploy, you haven't got access to that perception in order to pay attention to it. So it's all well and good to say we must be vigilant, but you must learn to be aware before you can be vigilant.
But David, I don't want to do the work. I don't want to go. I don't want to have therapy.
Nobody wants to do the work. That's a good point. Nobody does, do they?
I don't. I just want to sit in front of YouTube, David, and I want the answers of the universe to just come to me.
And to do meditations where you listen to somebody talking to you instead of actually doing anything as well. Easy, right?
So in preparation for this show, I was watching some videos on, I think there was a university lecture on cognitive biases, and it was in the context of the cognitive biases that people have who do fall down the rabbit hole of the crazy conspiracy theory. And this lecture went into all of these different things and how it mapped onto cognitive biases. But the lecturer happened to pick several examples of conspiracies that probably have some grain of truth to them. And this individual was not applying the same rigor to themselves. So, in other words, they were giving a lecture on cognitive biases without the self awareness of, hey, they haven't even done this homework in their own lives because they're just mindlessly attacking all these people who believe these things, some of which are probably not wrong, right? So it was just very ironic that this even the people who lecture on this stuff don't always have the self-awareness to realize that they haven't done their own due diligence in their own belief stack.
Well, academia is another system, right? This is why when we have new, like, look at, I don't know, quantum physics coming along, we had to wait for a whole generation of scientists to die off, and we're still kind of stuck with Newtonian models because they're useful models, even if we can say, well, they're wrong. I mean, quantum physics is probably wrong as well until somebody comes up with a grand unified theory of everything. But if you're an academic and you've been publishing on this one theory and using that model successfully for 40 years and based your whole career off it, that's really valuable to you. That can't be wrong. That's your whole identity. Like, you don't want some whippersnapper to come along and say, look, this is a much better model. We should all be using this. Because they must be wrong, because otherwise you die. Your identity dies. So we get stuck in these things. And, this is a problem with academia. And you can trace it to ego and to incentive.
Oh, absolutely.
We have a lot of the a priori belief, which just simply means that this can't be true, so therefore I won't even look at it. And so in your example of the presenter who says, here's how you apply the reason in a structured format to address things in a skeptical but responsibly skeptical way, was unable to do that to even the examples he was bringing up because that was even too far for him. So, and this happens in remote, I mean, maybe bring this a little bit back down to the topic of psi and just even application of remote viewing, is you see this in this field as well all the time. And specifically when it comes to topics that are completely non-feedbackable.
Aliens on the moon.
The origin of reality. Like, how about that? There's zero feedback ever for that. It's always going to be a story. Whether it's a story from a superstition, whether it's a story from a religion, whether it's a story from a novel or a story from a remote viewing session, it will always be a story. Now, is there merit and value in these stories? I think there absolutely can be. But just because you remote viewing something that has zero feedback and never will have any feedback, at least from what we can perceive, how you operate with that information is important, because you shouldn't make huge life-altering decisions based on zero feedbackable psychical data. I think that is not responsible. That is not being vigilant. It doesn't mean not to look. Doesn't mean it's not fascinating and interesting. It doesn't mean that adding another point of view to an already diverse form of discovery that you're doing, that you shouldn't do that. But it's like, aha, it came from a remote viewer, therefore it must be real. That is not vigilant. That is irresponsible. Just because one remote viewer, and there's evidence of this, where remote viewers get it wrong. Not all the time, some of the times. And sometimes there's conflicting stories from remote viewers. There's a very common example that's trotted out from different remote viewing groups. They all looked at independently of the same plane crash to try and figure out what happened there. And they all came back with different stories. Which one was right? Could they all have been right? Maybe they all were wrong. So don't take it as gospel. I think that's when remote viewing data becomes dogma. I really think you're off the path when it comes to discernment. You're now into religion, cult-like territory. Please don't go there. It doesn't lead to a good place. And so everything we do, there's obviously degrees of feedback on things where it's like, hey, okay, pyramids. What was the origin of the pyramids? We can remote view that. We can describe a narrative and a story. There's some feedback to that because there is the historical record we can look at. We can see if some of our stuff matches some of the known variables and say, okay, here's known variables that match our remote viewing data, and here's unknown remote viewing data that is a potential explanation for what happened. But you know what? It's remote viewing data. It's still not gospel. Even back when they used this as an intelligence gathering tool, they used it as only one source of information that needed to be corroborated by others. Do the same. Please don't use remote viewing data as gospel. You may as well just join a cult at that point.
We should expand that and say any in the magical community, this is referred to as unverified personal gnosis, or UPG, which is, well, you experienced that. That's great. It doesn't mean this is a transferable fact which is relevant or true, or, that's just good for you. Good for you having this experience. I hope it was useful to you, and that's it. It's almost a joke, the UPG. And the plane crash, that was, what is it, TWA 800? Is that the one? Something like that, anyway. Just to note on that one, they did all still describe aeroplanes and engines, and all the data was consistent with a air crash of some sort, but the causes were different, which highlights a really tricky, screwy problem with remote viewing and other psi perception. And there is something really funny going on with it, and we don't know what it is.
Ultimately, we're operators, those who are applying psychical functioning, whether it's from remote viewing or spontaneous intuition or just even traditional psi that's free form, that's just totally spontaneous with no structure, is we are operators. We don't necessarily know why it works under the hood. In fact, no one knows why it works under the hood.
No, anybody who says they do, red flag.
Red flag. And so there's models out there to try and explain it, whether it's a multiverse theory or it's a probabilistic future theory or whether it's a collective consciousness theory. Maybe it's all of them or none of them. We don't know. We don't have those tools yet to empirically and objectively look. But what we do have is we have stacks and stacks and stacks of empirical experiments showing that this functioning is not only real, but is repeatable and actionable and useful in the everyday life. And so, that's what fascinates me about it. I do it every single day. I have clients that I do precognitive work for in the stock market, and they make money and I make money off of it. I can't get more objective and real than that. But does that mean that everything that you're going to get from this is going to be 100% accurate or true? No, because neither is my forecasting. My forecasting is not 100% accurate, and I'm not sure it ever can be.
Well, do you remember we did look at that with a bit of impromptu remote viewing once, and I think the phrase used was "the world is not ready." But again, that's remote viewing data. You've got to take it with a huge pinch of salt. I heard a story. I don't know if this is true, and it was associated with what is definitely a cult, which I won't name because you'll have developed your discernment after listening to us today, so you won't need anybody else to warn you about cults. But this was a remote viewing teacher who was in cahoots with this cult and was teaching their students that they needed to make a deal with, quote unquote, a dark god in order to be a remote viewer. This is also a red flag. Do not do that. Just wanted to throw that out there. No dark gods. Sounds sketchy.
Well, it's remote viewing was something that was fresh when it came out. It has an enticing aspect of it because it was developed by Stanford Research Institute in collaboration with psychics, with funding from the military. What a fascinating backstory of that, and it's interesting. It has a really interesting spy thriller history to it, which attracts a lot of people to it, maybe for the wrong reasons, actually, but attraction nonetheless. And there are bad actors out there that want to capitalize and scoop up the unwitting individual who doesn't have the ability to say, hold on a minute, does this person have my best intention in mind, or are they trying to do something that would take advantage of me, whether it's monetarily or for some other purpose? Who knows what that purpose would be? This is why the responsibility onus is always on the individual. Take responsibility for yourself. No one's going to save you. You have to do that yourself.
I couldn't agree with you more, Brett. I think there is another element to helping refine discernment that just occurred to me. That's something that I do over time is we do it formally in remote viewing. Hopefully, if we're good at our craft, we record and document as a track record how many hits, how many misses, etc. I think it's useful to do this in a general sense as well. So you have certain predictions that you've made about, okay, my model of the world is such. Using whether it's spontaneous intuition or whether it's formal remote viewing or whether it's forensic history research or whatever, you're going to come up with certain predictions about how things are. If there comes to a point in the future where there is some feedback available, maybe it was a future event you forecasted, maybe there was some new evidence that came to light through a research paper, it's important to note, okay, yeah, that was correct, or actually, no, the thing I thought was correct turns out that this new evidence contradicts what I thought was correct, so I got it wrong. And you can use this feedback as a calibration tool to see, okay, well, why did I get it wrong? What assumptions did I make? What due diligence didn't I do that allowed me to? Because no one's going to be perfect ever. And if you think you're correct with all your predictions, then you're probably not. But these track records, whether you can make note of them mentally or on paper, are very helpful, both in formal remote viewing, even spontaneous intuition, and being honest with yourself. Yeah, I thought this thing was true and it's just not, right? I think that's a healthy check to have in place.
I'm sorry, Emily, but you're asking me to do more work right now? You want me to keep track of this stuff? Well, I just would rather not do that.
Or even the sources you follow. Track the sources you follow. There's so many people that follow certain individuals, like, oh, this person's so great. And yeah, occasionally they get a hit, but they got 12 misses in between that one hit. And it's like, well, there's a lot of noise in that signal. I don't know. I'd rather follow someone who has 8 hits and 1 miss, right? So
this is something that I've stressed a lot in my master classes and to my previous students that I've helped develop the remote viewing skill to apply in financial markets, is that if you are not being incredibly diligent about tracking your work over time, you have no idea where you are right now. And if you don't know where you are right now, how in the world can you trust and make a financial investment strategy around that? You have to track it. You have to see where you're at. You have to be honest about this was a miss or this was a hit. And unfortunately, that makes people uncomfortable because, and I understand why, it makes people uncomfortable even in the really basic training process of these skills. They don't want to be wrong because they're spending money and time and effort in doing something that is a little bit anomalous and kind of weird on how they're modulating their perception. And if they're wrong, then maybe they're wasting their time and they're making a fool of themselves. And so there's actually a vested interest in deluding themselves to not see the actual end result where maybe they're only 20% correct. And could that just be chance and maybe they can't do it? So there's actually one of the reasons I think people don't track their results or are uninterested in applying that elsewhere, because that means that they might feel guilty about themselves not tracking their own work, is because they're afraid that they can't do it. And they might be exposed, or they might, even if just the exposure is to themselves as a fraud. And people don't want that. They don't want that. Maybe they don't fully believe it. Maybe they haven't had that dark night of the soul.
There's so many factors that cause people to have that desire to be right. I could just like reel them off. But teaching people remote viewing so that you can like instill that it's good when you're wrong because you get to learn. You get to go over your session with your feedback and take yourself back there and say, how did I feel? I had somebody the other day say, I missed the target completely. And then I went back to the beginning once I got my feedback and realized that there was anxiety there. I did have a fear of failure, just like you said I would, and I said I wouldn't, and then I did. But he went back and identified it. And, when you look at these things and bring them out in the open, it's fine, isn't it?
You can't change if you're not aware of the behavior. You can't.
This goes back to what we were saying before. You got to have the awareness to have the diligence. And if you're going, I have no fear of failure, it's cool, I'm a scientist. And then you're like, yeah, but I really want to be right. Really want to be right. I don't want to look dumb in front of my teacher, or, like you said, waste my money, or have my worldview ruined. Oh, there's just like so many reasons, isn't there?
All right. Well, with that, I think that's a good place to wrap up this After Hours. And I hope you all enjoyed this extended discussion with Emily, myself, and David. We're really excited to continue doing these. We have fun. We've been doing these things already. So really, we're not putting ourselves out of our time because we're so fascinated and we love these discussions to begin with. So we really appreciate you supporting us and joining us on this journey to see where this podcast goes. We'll be doing more of these after-hour shows, obviously, whether that's with potential future guests. Some of the other topics that are coming are going to be deep dives on actual topics, whether it's a mysteries topic or whether it's something that's going on in the current environment, or it's just popular. So, we're figuring it out as we go, but thank you for joining us on this ride, and we shall see you on the next Cypher podcast.